This talk is going to be about Composer and how to integrate Composer in Drupal 8 or with Drupal 8 development workflow. So thanks a lot to all of you for coming today here to this session. And in exchange for your time, I promise that you will not leave empty-handed, metaphorically speaking, of course. Now, I'd like to thank Nacho Olgueras at IS Olgueras on Twitter. He was the one, well, he's here. He was the one that gave this presentation originally back in January in a Drupal and BIOS meetup here in Madrid. And he was kind enough to let me use his slides for the presentation. So, just to give you some information about myself, my name is Salva. I'm a Drupal developer at BlueSpark, and well, that's my nickname in Drupal.org, my Twitter account, GitHub, and blog URL. And yeah, that's the banner of my blog. I wanted to put it there just to show you how good an artist I am. And as I said, we are going to talk about Composer. So I'm going to start with some Composer basics. Then I will move into the Drupal project part of the session, which is the most important one. And then we'll wrap up with just a recap of things and maybe some debate on some of the Composer practices. Now, the goal for me on this presentation is that for those of you who have never used Composer, you leave the room with a clear idea of how a powerful and useful tool it is, and the fact that it doesn't need much investment in order to be able to use it. So maybe as of next Monday, you can be the new rock star in your team at the office. If you have worked with Composer before, but not too much, and you're not using it yet on Drupal 8, and you're maybe a lead developer or a team lead, maybe you can get some useful ideas to start implementing them in your development workflow as well, and maybe have a more professional workflow. So let's get into the Composer basics. Can anyone tell me what Composer is? Yeah?
Dependency manager.
That's a perfect definition of what Composer is. Now, Composer is indeed a dependency manager for PHP projects. They can be command line projects or they can be website projects. It doesn't really matter. It is not a package manager, okay? Normally, a package manager is something that we use to install packages on a server or on the operating system, and then we use these packages or tools whenever we want and wherever we want. With a dependency manager, we are installing dependencies only for a given project, and that's all. If we need the same dependency on another project, then we have to install the same dependency on that other project. Now, for those of you who have worked with Node.js or Ruby, Composer is quite inspired by Node's NPM and Ruby's bundler, so you will notice that it's very, very similar. Okay, so one of the best ways to explain Composer is to talk about the composer.json file. You can think of this as a manifest of your project, where you define all the metadata and the useful information that you need in order to work with it. So, of course, we define the name of the project. What you see here is a very common convention in Composer. So every time that we are talking about a dependency or a package or a library in a Composer context, we don't only name the name of the project. We have to use the vendor name and the project name. As we will see later, in Drupal, the vendor will always be Drupal, and then if we want to install a module, the project name will be the module name. Now, this is the most important bit of the JSON file, because at the end of the day, we are working with dependencies. So the required attribute in the composer.json is the attribute that we use to include dependencies in the project. So basically, on the required attribute, we put a list of all the projects that we want to include in our code. So for example, here I have the Monologue project and the Robo project. For those of you who don't know Robo, it is something like Gulp or Grunt for JavaScript. So it's a task runner for PHP. Now, every time we include a dependency in Composer, Composer will expect us to include a version as well. We have multiple ways of defining versions on Composer. And the thing that we have to know right now is that we don't have to log our project to a given version of a dependency. Composer is very flexible in that regard, and it allows us to use what it calls version constraints, so that we can have a lot of flexibility in the versions that we accept. Of course, this is all stated in the documentation, and it allows us to use wildcards to accept, for example, anything that starts with 1.0 point whatever. And we can also use the caret symbol to tell Composer that we are happy to accept any version of Robo that is in the minor version number 1. So this could be 1.0.1, 1.0.2, or if there is a 1.2 version, then Composer will update to that one. However, with this constraint, if Robo includes a new major version, like the 2.0, we will not get that version by default, which is good because normally changes in major versions will break compatibility with the old ones. Now, the required dev attribute is the same thing, and it works in the same way, but Composer only looks at this in development servers. So we don't need PHP unit in a production server, so Composer will ignore it there. We have other attributes like the minimum stability if we want to accept development versions of the modules, and we could put that to a stable if we do not want development versions of the modules and we only want stable versions. And of course, normally we will prefer the stable versions. There's a whole list of other attributes that we can use in the JSON file, but so far these are the most important ones, and for the moment you don't need to know about the others, but they are very well documented in getcomposer.org. Now, this is the main file of the repo. There's another important file, which is the composer.log. The composer.log is essentially like an index of every dependency that we have installed in our code or in our project. So we saw before that we are required in this library. So for each package here, for each dependency, composer.log will have a whole section like this. And basically, it tells Composer the exact version that is installed on our project at any given time. So when I ran Composer install here a few months ago, the latest version of Robo was 1.0.5. If today I wanted to update my dependency, maybe it will be 1.0.7. It has some more information, like, for example, the distributable type that, or the distribution that we downloaded. In this case, it was a zip file, and this was the URL where it got the zip file from that it installed later on the server. OK, so now that you get an idea of how Composer works, let's say that you want to try it. You have multiple options for doing this, and they are all well documented in Composer. This is the one that I like. I normally install it globally, and I basically download the installer and execute it, and then I will have it on my libraries. After installing Composer, there are 4 main commands that you will have to use from pretty much the first day. So the first one is composer.init. Composer.init is essentially a command line wizard that allows us to create a composer.json file very quickly. So the first time that we work with Composer, we don't know the attributes, so we execute Composer init, and basically it will ask questions on the command line, and we answer the questions like name of the project, description, whether we want to include a license for it, and some of the dependencies that we may want to include at the beginning. Now, after we have created our composer.json file, what we want to do is to run composer install. This will be the command that takes the dependencies from our composer files, downloads those dependencies, and then puts them on the vendor directory. So the way it works is that if there is a composer.log file in the repo, it will check the composer.log file. It will download the exact version of the log of its dependency, and it will put that version on vendor. However, the first time that we create the repo, we don't have a log file because it's not there for us. So in that case, it will read the composer.json file. Then it will resolve the dependencies by looking at what are the most up-to-date versions of the libraries that we need, and then it will download those files for us and put them on the vendor directory. Of course, the first time, the log file won't be there, so it will create the log file for us. And the point of this is that we can commit the log file to the repository, and the next time that a new developer comes into the project, he pulls the repo, he types composer install, and then we make sure that he will have the same versions that we have on our computers, which is a good thing. We don't want two developers working with different versions of the dependencies. Now, a few weeks into the project, we decided we want to update some dependencies, and we have the composer update command for that. Composer update command works always in the same way. It reads composer.json, it resolves the versions for each dependency, and then it figures out if there's a new library or a new version for a dependency that fits the version constraint that we specified in the composer.json. If there are, it will put those libraries in the vendor directory, it will replace the old ones with the new ones, and it will update the log file to reflect that that particular library was updated. Finally, when we want to include a new dependency in our project, because maybe we decide that we want to use panels module, we can do it with composer require. Composer require expects that you tell it what dependency you have and the version that you want for that dependency. And after you do that, it will update the composer.json file to include that dependency. It will update the composer.log file to, of course, include that it has downloaded the particular version of that dependency, and it will put the new library in vendor. And this is pretty much these are the four main commands that you need to understand in order to get started with Composer. Of course, there are more. There are well documented as well, but these are the most important ones. Now, after we install all the different dependencies, or we actually run Composer install for the first time, we will find these two files, well, this directory and this file on the repo. The vendor is where libraries are stored, as you already know, and it's not always vendor. Well, it's always vendor by default, but it's configurable. So you could have dependencies in another library. This is the most important file that you have to understand in order to work with Composer, but you only have to understand a single bit, a little bit of it. Think of the autoloader as the single one PHP file that you have to use in your custom code in order to be able to use the dependencies that you download. So your custom code, your project will have an app.php file or an index.php file. So all you have to do there is require the autoload. Now, the autoload is what basically resolves all the dependencies, class names, and classes to the path that they are in the files, where they are in the file system, so that we can use them without any hassle on the code. Now, I know it would be great to have a quick demo of things, but this is really, really simple stuff. There's a lot of online content for this, and I think it's better if we just move on to Drupal project. So, Drupal project. I'd like to explain before getting into Drupal project what are these two terms, because the first time I was learning about this, I was quite confused by them. So just to make it clear, Drupal Composer is one thing and Drupal project is another thing. Drupal Composer is a working group to make Composer work with Drupal. So it is not a tool, it is not a project, it is not something that we download, it is just a group of people. Drupal project is a project from the Drupal Composer group that is basically a template for working with Drupal 8 projects and Composer. So when I say template, what I'm talking about is a composer.json file that comes predefined with some particular attributes to make Composer work in a way that is good for Drupal. In this template, we have some scripts included by default as well that will do some things under the hood that we will talk about later to make our lives easier. Do we need Drupal project to work with Composer on Drupal? We don't, but chances are that we will have to do a lot of work ourselves in order to make it work properly. Now, so what is this template for, or what does it do? So first, it will install Drupal in the web directory when we type composer install. And another thing that it will do is that it will alter the default autoloader file provided by Drupal in order to make it point to the one generated by Composer. And the reason is that the default autoloader from Drupal will always, with that, we will be able to reference only Drupal code. By doing this, we are able to use other dependencies that maybe are not included by Drupal. Well, I guess most of you are Drupal developers, so you all know that contrib modules and themes and profiles have to be in a particular directory for Drupal to pick them up. So one of the things that the template does is automatically downloading these modules into the relevant places where they should be. So yeah, I said before that all dependencies are in the vendor directory. In this case, these dependencies will not be on the vendor directory. They will be in the relevant folder. Other things that it does is that creates default readable versions of settings.php and services.yaml. It creates the files directory by default, makes it completely readable for our convenience in development, and it will install the latest versions of Drush and Drupal console. So if you have Drush and Drupal console in your laptop globally, you can use it. But if you choose to use these ones, you have always the most up-to-date versions in the actual project. OK, so hopefully you are now falling in love with Drupal project because it looks really cool. So let's say that you want to create a new project with it, and you want to try it on a Drupal 8 site. So you can do it with this simple command. Maybe not so simple, but it will be quite clear now. Create project is another command from Composer. I didn't explain it before because it doesn't do anything that we can do with other commands. It is equivalent to downloading the Drupal project repo, then cd into it, and then run Composer install. It is the same result. So with Composer create project, we specify vendor name, Drupal Composer, project name, Drupal project, and then we use the 8 branch. We specify the directory where we want to put our site. Stability, this will be the minimum stability for our modules, and no interaction flag, which is useful for CI scripts, so that we don't get asked any questions. Basically, we'll use the default. The result of executing that command is basically this. Git ignore file with some defaults, composer.json, composer.log, config file. Another thing that the repo does is that it alters the settings.php file that it creates by default, and it includes a line telling Drupal that it can find documentation in the config folder, which is above the Drupal folder. We have also the Drush Drush folder that we'll talk about later on, and some of the other scaffolding files. The scripts folder contains scripts for the Drupal project itself to do some of the things that we've been describing before. Of course, we have vendor and we have web, which is where Drupal will be. Now, some of you might be maybe a bit reluctant because you say, OK, this is all looking very, very cool, but everything looks very cool at the beginning, and at the end of the day, if I need to put this to use with my new team, maybe they are not used to Drupal and they will not know how to use it, or maybe it's a bit difficult. So let's jump into a few scenarios that will cover the usual tasks that we have to do as Drupal developers, the bread and butter of Drupal. So let's say that you have the repo that you set up for your new site, and then the development team comes and starts to work on it. So what do they have to do? Of course, they will have to clone the repo that you have in your company. They will cd into the repo, they will type composer install, and because the log file will be there committed by you on the first day, they will get all the dependencies downloaded on the site. Now, this is pretty much the only different bit that you have to worry about compared to a normal workflow or to the workflow without using Composer. After you have the dependencies, you see into the web folder, which is, again, where Drupal is. And we just install the site locally. So we install the install profile that we want. Or if we have a production or a stage database, then we just put that one on our local environments, and we can start work on it. One of the most common tasks that we do as developers is to download, update modules, and remove them when they don't work, or when we don't need them anymore. So again, we use the Composer commands that we talked about before. So Composer require, let's say that we want to install the Display Suite module. With Composer require, we type, again, vendor name, Drupal, project name, and it will be downloaded. We want to remove it because we don't like it anymore, Composer remove. We want to update it, yes, Composer update, and same, vendor name, project name. We can, for example, use a wildcard as well, so we can update all the modules that follow a given pattern on the name. Now, one important thing to keep in mind, Composer is not there to replace Drush. We are still going to use Drush. Composer, again, is a dependency management. It doesn't care about Drupal. We can use it with Symfony, we can use it with Laravel, we can use it with whatever project we have. After this, we only have the code in the project, but it's not installed. So we have to cd into the web folder and run Drush update database or Drush enable with the actual module. Another common task is to update Drupal core when we are working on a project, and then there's a security update. So the principle is the same. Composer update, Drupal/core. And then it's really important that we use this flag with dependencies. The reason is that, as you may know, Drupal 8 comes with a lot of components from Symfony. If we don't use the with dependencies flag, those components will not be updated, which means Drupal and those components will be out of sync. The site could break. Maybe it doesn't break, but it could break. And the worst thing is that it could actually break without being obvious, so we could find out when we are in production. So basically, just make sure you include this part. Now we have to do a git diff to see if there are any actual changes on the repo after including Drupal core. Sorry, do you want to leave that? OK. So let's say that there are no conflicts. Everything's fine. We run Drush update database. We test the site locally, and we are good to go. So we commit the change to the repo. If there are conflicts, the best practice would be to create a new branch. So don't work on master branch. Fix the conflicts, which they will normally be in htaccess file or robots.txt file. And after we are good, then we merge to master, if possible, in one commit, because if things go wrong, then we can roll back easily by just reverting one commit instead of several. And then we are done. The final common thing that we have to do as developers is to patch modules from time to time. Hopefully, you are not hacking modules directly, and you are actually applying patches from Drupal.org and documenting them. But if you are not doing that, with Drupal project, you get out of the box a good workflow to do that. So in the composer.json file, you can use the extra attribute to include a patches section. And in this section, we can specify for each project a line. We can include a line for each project with a description of the patch and the URL of the patch. What happens with this is that the next time, well, every time that we type composer install or composer update on the command line, Drupal project will notice that you are using patches, and after updating or installing the dependencies, it will patch them. It will apply the patch, and everything should be working as per the patch. This is not the only way to include patches. There are some other options, but this is the one that comes included by default. Also, this option here is not provided by Composer. This is not core in Composer. This is provided by a Composer plugin that is included in Drupal project. So if you were working with another project that is not Drupal project, then you will have to include this in some other way. But it's equally easy. Now, all of this sounds really cool. But there are a few things to consider, or a few interesting bits that work behind the scenes in order to make this happen. So I'd like to talk about those a little bit. Not only because it's good to know them, but also because I think they will give you a great idea of what other things you can do with Composer if this is not enough for you. So one of the most important bits is the Drupal scaffold project. The Drupal scaffold project is also another project from the Drupal Composer group, and it's included by default in the Drupal project. It is included, of course, as a dependency with the required attribute in composer.json, and it is essentially a part of the scripts attribute as well. So the dependency is included on one side, and then in the scripts attribute, Drupal project specifies a specific script in PHP that is Drupal scaffold. What happens is that every time we type composer install or composer update, Drupal scaffold will download these files, among others. So index.php, update.php, the robots.txt file, and the htaccess file. And now, for those of you who have only worked with Drush, you may be thinking, well, why should I do this? So if I'm installing Drupal or updating Drupal, am I not getting these files by default? And the answer is no. The answer is, with Drupal project in the composer.json, we are not downloading Drupal as we download it from Drupal.org. We are downloading Drupal core. And these files are outside of Drupal core. So essentially, normally, we will have to, if we downloaded Drupal core ourselves, we will have to get these ones manually. However, Drupal scaffold knows about this, so it does everything automatically for us. It will also create new files from the default.settings.php and the services file. So for example, by default, it will create the settings.php file if it's not there on the repo. If it is there, it means we are already working with Drupal, it's installed, it doesn't have to create a new one. Also, other than Drush policy, other than Drupal scaffold, we have Drush policy. Any of you knew about Drupal policy? That's good, because then you're learning something new today. To be honest, this has been around for at least 3-4 years, easily, in Drush. This is not part of Drupal project, this is just core Drush. And 1 month ago, I didn't even know about this. But it's actually a really, really nice thing. So Drush policy is basically a file that we can include in our Drush directory. And through that file, we can basically validate every Drush command that we run. Every command. It doesn't have to be declared in any particular way. As every Drush command that we have on our site will pass through that file if we implement a hook for that. What we can do with this is that we can, for example, avoid execution of Drush PM update or PM enable or remove or whatever. Now, this is probably not making any sense. You are thinking, oh, why would I not want that? I want to install things with Drush. What's bad about it? Well, what is bad about it is that in this context, we are supposedly using Drupal project, and we are using Composer for dependencies. If you remove or if you install a module with Drush, it means that the composer.json file will not be updated properly, and there will be a mix of things that are in composer.json and other things that you will have in the repo that are not installed with composer.json. So with Drush policy, we make sure that no one is able to execute this. And if they type that command on the command line, they will get a warning saying, access denied, you have to use Composer. We can alter Drush aliases, and for example, on the SQL sync command, we can avoid writing in production. If you have used the SQL sync command before, you know that it's really easy with just one command to, for example, put the database from production into a stage or into your local environment. However, it is equally easy to switch the order of the parameters and accidentally write the development database in production, and then you will be in trouble. So with Drush policy, we basically implement a hook and say, if the destination is production, this is not going to be executed, deny access. Now notice the asterisk there. This is not enabled by default. This particular line, it has to be added. However, there is the exact code for how to do this is in the examples folder of Drush. So yeah, the slides will be online, and you will be able to check this. But basically, in the examples folder, there is a policy.drush.inc that you can use as examples, and it includes a lot of documentation of how else you can use it. Now, you might want to use this, you might not want to use it. It has its use cases. It is useful if, for example, you are starting with Drupal 8 and people don't know what process to follow, and you want to make sure that everyone in the team is working in the same way. Or maybe you have naughty developers that they don't care about process. Or again, they have problems following the workflow. You can use Drush policy. What I would say is grab them by the policy. So that's a good way to make sure that they follow the right process. Sorry, terrible joke. OK, so let's wrap things up. So before Composer, we had a really good dependency management in Drupal. I mean, you could compare that with the one from WordPress, and yeah, there's no color. However, it was good for Drupal packages, Drupal modules, themes, profiles. Now with Composer, we have an amazing dependency management that makes it easy for Drupal packages, but also for other libraries. So for example, we want to use the task runner I described before, Robo. It's really easy to include it. We can have all contrib out of Git, and even Drupal core. Some people think that's a good thing. I don't quite agree. This is not necessarily, as I get it, a good thing, but it's something that you could do. We have Composer hooks as well. They're pretty much like Drupal hooks. Basically, every time we type a Composer command on the command line, there are hooks that we can implement in order to alter the workflow. That way, we can use the workflow that we want, and we can include as many things as we want to make it more professional or more complete. It is the standard tool used in PHP for dependency management. It's not the only one. It's the one I know, and it's the de facto standard. And of course, if you don't have a patching policy or a patching workflow yet, you have something by default now with the project. It's also available for Drupal 7, not in the same way that I described with Drupal project, but you can use it nevertheless. So if you have a module that requires other libraries, you can use Composer. You can install dependencies, other libraries from Symfony, and they will work completely fine. Now, the downside of things is that it's a bit more strict than the classical way. I don't think that's bad. I think that's better, a more restrictive workflow, but maybe a more ordered workflow where everyone is working in the same way. Bad thing is that it has another point of failure. Composer, from time to time, it might decide to fail. It's not common, but it could do. It's really not common at all. Don't get scared by that. An actual downside of it is that if we have, every time that we are deploying something in a new server, if we are using Composer for actual deployment, if GitHub is down, or Packages is down, or Drupal.org is down, then yeah, the deployment will fail because we won't be able to download the dependencies, and we'll have to maybe wait a few minutes and try again. Same if internet is just slow, but well, that will happen when you download anything, really. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about this. Composer documentation says that you should not commit the vendor directory, and Drupal project in particular does this, of course. And it does the same for contrib modules, themes, and profiles. Now, I don't entirely agree with this. And here's what I think we should be thinking about when following the Composer documentation in this regard. I mean, Composer documentation is great, really. It's very, very complete and is accurate. However, in this particular bit, it doesn't cover every possible case. So think about software distribution versus software deployment. Now, are you writing a web crawler library that you want to contribute to the community and that you want other people to use? Then you may be using the Gazelle library from PHP. Now, in that case, you don't want to include Gazelle with your library. It doesn't make sense. You just put Gazelle on the Composer file, and you let Composer download Gazelle for you if someone wants to use your library. That is one thing. Another thing is, if we are putting software in a production server for a customer, we are putting a site. In that case, we have different requirements, and we have of robustness of deployments, and we are basically doing a different thing. It's not the same to distribute a package for people to use and put a living project from one server into another. Also, we need to think about whether we want to have Git history on the repo so that we are able to check what happened in this particular commit and what exactly changed. Because if something breaks on production, then we will want to see what was the exact change that went live last week. If we don't commit the vendor directory, we will not see that change. We will see a change in composer.log that tells us, oh, we moved from version 1 to version 2, and a hash changed. That's all we will see. That's, for me as a developer responsible for putting code in production, that is not useful. And that's not an answer that I can give a client. Oh, I don't know what happened. It's broke, sorry. I'll look into it. Git size. This could be a problem, but frankly, I don't think it will be in most cases. Yeah, we need to think about best practices as well, such as code review or code auditing. Again, as developers, we are told that we should be doing code review in our code, but frankly, we shouldn't be doing that only in our code. There is no reason to trust blindly everything that comes from the internet. So we should do at least a little bit of auditing in contrib modules. So essentially, I'm not saying that if you are committing or if you plan to commit or not commit the vendor directory, you are doing it wrong or you are doing it right. I don't really care. What I'm saying is don't blindly follow. This applies to everything, really, in software development. Don't blindly follow Composer documentation on this matter. It might not be what applies to you. It might not be what it makes sense in your particular case. So think about these elements and then decide by yourself. So a summary of things. If we put things in the repo, we have more robust deployments because everything is in the repo. You download it, and you're done. You don't have to go to packages, Drupal, GitHub, whatever. They are easier and more straightforward to manage. We have proper auditing of production code with clear, accessible history of code changes. And in some very specific cases for certain development packages that do not have that only have a Git version for you to download, maybe there's a little bit of extra work which is very easy to do, and you can do it just once, and it will apply to the whole project life. Maybe we have to do that amount of work, which is really tiny, to make sure everything will work fine. If we do not Git the vendor directory on the contrib modules, well, we have more complexity in deployments with more chance for builds to break due to external systems. We can't audit code changes, and yeah, we have a bit smaller repository, but it's 2017, so probably that's not too good. Now, all this process of downloading dependencies locally in your repo and not committing them, and then you have to go into the dev environment and download them again, but then if you move into a new environment, you have to download them again, reminded me a little bit to this joke from a monologue from a Spanish comedian. It's in Spanish, so if there are non-Spanish speakers here, I'm sorry. However, I put subtitles on it, so hopefully you will understand it.
Inferior, ¿no? Él considera que eres un tío que se lo pasa bien tirando un palo mientras que él va corriendo, lo coge por la boca con la arena y mierda que hay en el suelo, te lo vuelve a traer para después volver a lanzárselo. Y dices, hostia, vaya mierda de juego nos hemos inventado. No sé, quiero decir, a mí lo que más me jodía en el mundo era venir del instituto y que me mandaran a por el pan, ¿no? Yo llegaba allí y me decían, a por el pan. Y pues tú imagínate que voy, lo compro, traigo el pan y me dicen, a por el pan.
Well, that was it. So, yeah, sorry, I really liked that joke. I think it was relevant. So I think that's all for me. If you have any questions, I will be happy to try my best to answer them. So, yeah.
English or Spanish?
As you prefer, I guess. Are there any non-Spanish speakers here? Yeah, so English, please.
English, okay. So if you do use Git if you get the vendor directory, if you do a composer install, how does it know that it's the right versions? Or does it just download it again?
It will know that it has, it will know what version it has to download and that you don't have the new version because that information will still be in the composer.json file and the composer.log file. Sorry, actually in the composer.log file.
But if you do have the vendor directory, so you already downloaded it with Git, how does it know that it's the right version? You know what I mean?
I don't think I'm understanding the question. It's all, yeah, it's in the. But something could go wrong, and somebody could. Okay, like you have to make sure you upload absolutely everything in the composer log, so that the vendor is never out of sync with the log. Yes, the composer.log file should be always committed if you are working, for example, on a customer site or a customer application. If you are adding, if you are creating a library for someone else to use, maybe you don't want the composer log file because in that case, you are okay with whatever versions of the dependencies of that library.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if I answered the question because I'm not sure I got it completely right, but if you have still any doubts, we can go through it afterwards. Thank you.
Good talk. I wanted to ask, how do you manage the path environment variable for using Rust and Drupal console, the one that you have in your project and not the one that you have installed globally?
Well, you have two options. One is you don't manage. So basically you just type .. to reference the vendor.
Bin,
yep.
blah, blah, blah.
The other option is you could have a bash script locally to make sure, and actually make that script part of your composer.json to make sure that every time you download it, you will create a symlink from USR local bin to the new one that you update. So you can do some magic to make that happen. It's not included by Drupal project by default, but you could do something as simple as that. I don't know of any other way, but that's what I will do personally.
Okay, and I missed one step after you update a Drupal core or a project. You do Rust appdb, but you also should export the configuration also because some configuration might have changed with appdb.
Yes,
yeah.
you will follow.
Okay.
I mean, that was a reduced workflow, of course, but yes, you will have to apply.
Okay.
Also, if you have a more specific workflow, like you want to run some checks on Drupal or whatever, then you will put those
run your test
in between.
Whatever.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, that was it.
Any more questions?
Well, so before we get finished, I'd like to do some spam. Sorry about that. So we have a reading club. It's called OPHP and Reads. Basically we read books about PHP, PHP updates with new versions. Yay, excitement. It's in Spanish, and we basically gather like once a month on Hangouts. If you want to join, it's an open group. Just look for that hashtag on Twitter. And otherwise, you can ask Nacho, who is the one that created the group. He's got a blog post in his blog. You're very welcome to join the Hangouts anytime, so feel free to do so. Other than that, I would like to thank you for your time, for listening to me, and hopefully you learned lots of new things today, as I promised to you earlier. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference and see you around.